Secretary Buttigieg, thank you for joining us. It's going to be a very busy travel weekend. You look at what happened last summer. Obviously, a lot of folks worried about what could be in our future. Are we ready?
Well, it's only Friday, but so far so good. Yesterday, we saw a record, the most air passengers, according to the preliminary data, that we've seen at any time since before the pandemic, and cancellations were less than 1%. So, all the pressure we put on airlines last year, I want to give them some credit. They have stepped up. They have improved hiring. They've got more realistic schedules. We're a long way from saying we're out of the woods or we're fully comfortable, but we've seen a lot of real progress. The other thing, of course, that's paid off is all the work that we did last year to improve passenger rights means that this year, if you do get stuck, if you do have a problem, you are much more likely to be able to expect that your hotel or meal or rebooking or whatever you need is going to be covered. So, look, this is a big stress test of the system. We're seeing huge demand. But so far, this holiday weekend appears to be headed in a good direction. We do see some weather coming in. We're keeping a close eye on that. No one can control the weather, but what we're really looking for is whether the system now has enough cushion to handle any kind of weather that comes in and get back on its feet quickly.
I'm glad you brought up some of the changes, Secretary, because I was looking at the dashboard and what different airlines have to offer. And I do want to stick with this conversation that we're talking about airlines here, because that was the most kind of problematic last summer. And when you're looking at the compensation that passengers can get when it comes to cancellations, it seems like a lot of airlines are on board with that. But when it comes to delays beyond 3 hours, it seems as if they are more resistant to providing compensation there. And there are stories of folks sitting on that tarmac for 7, 8, 9 hours. And unless you had some sort of status on that airline, you got nothing for it. What's being done to change that?
Well, that's right. I'm glad you mentioned the dashboard. That's at flightrights.gov, and you can see airline by airline who's going to cover your meal, who's going to give you extra compensation, who's going to rebook you no matter what. And that transparency is part of how we got the airlines to make more enforceable commitments about what they would do. We've gone from none of the top 10 airlines to almost all of them offering a lot of those kinds of ground transportation meals vouchers. But what we still don't see is compensation for your time. There are a lot of countries where if you get a cancellation or a delay, and it's something that the airline could have prevented, you are entitled to compensation in terms of cash or at least a voucher. Very few airlines offer that today. It's why President Biden and I a few weeks ago announced a process to launch a rule that would require that. I'd like to see more airlines step up in the meantime. But either way, we're going to move forward on this rulemaking because we think it's important not only that you can get a refund if your flight gets canceled, but if you're waiting hours and hours and it's because of something the airline did wrong, that they show some regard for your time as well.
How cooperative are the airlines being with the administration, Secretary?
Look, on this rule, I'll tell you, they hate it. They don't like the idea of having to pay passengers for those major delays and cancellations. I think they're going to push back pretty hard. On the other hand, I will say that we've been collaborating on the operational side. What we've seen is that there are a lot of areas where we can work together to make things go more smoothly. Your reporter mentioned those 169 new routes. These are basically, you can kind of think of them like highways through the sky that air traffic control puts the aircraft on. We've been able to use technology to create more efficient routes. That means less time in the air and less congestion and fuel savings. We've worked in the New York market to allow airlines flexibility so they can use larger aircraft on the same routes. What that means is more seats with less congestion. The Florida airspace, we're trying to help airlines. Believe it or not, we have so many commercial space launches taking place now that it's affecting the ability of aircraft to get to where they go because you've got to close down a big box of airspace during a certain launch window. So we're working to try to push those launch windows with the space industry out of the busiest times when you really need passenger aircraft to take advantage of those routes. So we're going to collaborate where we can. We're also going to enforce where we should. And that kind of push-pull is the relationship we have with the airlines. But again, I want to give them credit where credit is due. It does appear so far that we're seeing some real improvements compared to what we saw a year ago.
So we, of course, have been watching 6 days now till June 1st, Secretary. While I have you, I want to talk to you quickly about the debt talks happening in Washington. If they're able to not reach a deal, worst case scenario, what happens to your department, the Transportation Department?
Well, look, that worst-case scenario is terrible for every part of the American economy and every part of American life. Travel is no exception. Remember the roller coaster we've been on with the American travel system. 2 years ago, airports, the big issue was whether they could stay open at all, whether the airlines were going to go out of business. We got through that. President Biden led an economic recovery that is part of the reason why right now demand for air travel is off the charts, and the big issue we're facing is the system being able to keep up instead of worrying about the system falling apart. Default would put us probably immediately into a recession, and across every transportation sector, of course, that has deeply negative consequences. One of many, many reasons why a default cannot be allowed to happen, and can't speak to the details of the negotiations going on right now, but that's obviously the end goal here, is to make sure default's off the table, and then we can negotiate on the push and pull of normal budget decisions.
Do you think, quickly here, Secretary, the president should get out front of the political push and pull, especially as we're looking towards the next election, making a primetime address and what he sees as the shortfalls of Republicans in this negotiating process?
Well, I'm not going to get into campaigning while I'm here on the official side, but what I will say is that I think the president's message has been very consistent about trying to keep politics at arm's length and just do the things that are going to make our economy and our country stronger. And a lot of the best examples for that are in the realm of transportation and infrastructure, where the president worked across the aisle, got a lot of Republicans working with Democrats to get that big infrastructure law through. And we're going around the country making announcements. Yesterday I was in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where we're improving the airport there, and then in Dubuque, where we're funding a plan that's going to help them potentially get rid of a railroad crossing that really blocks a lot of traffic in their town. Kinds of things that aren't partisan or political. And what I've noticed is, even those Republican congressional members who voted against the package, they're all for the projects that are coming out of it. I think that's evidence that kind of focus, that kind of center of gravity on just getting stuff done is what most Americans expect, even as the politics come and go.
Secretary Buttigieg, thank you for taking the time, sir. We appreciate it.